everyone, my name is Petar Dimitrov and I'm a lead system architect in SimCorp. And my mission on a day-to-day is to create a scalable software as a service configuration management so that we enable our products to scale and meet the needs of our customers, which are primarily financial institutions with very complicated business workflows. So I would like to start the presentation with a bit of a walkthrough of how the SaaS has evolved and over the last few years. Software as a service as such exists since roughly year 2000, where the first pioneers in the enterprise space were, for example, Salesforce, which also back then they enabled the subscription-based model as being the first movers in this. However, at that point in time, this business model and SaaS-based software is overall were considered more geared towards startup-based community or small businesses. And when it comes to complicated business workflows in specific industries, the large enterprises typically has chosen more on-premise-like solutions and building end-to-end flows within them. And of course, fast forward 20 years, we see quite a big shift. We see that, for example, from 2014 to now, the market has almost doubled in terms of software as a service usage. And we see that going forward, the large enterprises expect to have even greater software as a service consumption compared to before. And given where we are today with the evolution of software as a service, we see that there are a lot of horizontal solutions which provide very broad functionality across different industries. For example, Workday, Salesforce, or more PaaS-based solutions like Azure DevOps. And this is where to take the next natural level into software as a service, the companies are looking to take their complicated workflows, decompose them as much as possible and make them efficient. And this is where the new vertical software as a service space comes into play. And that's a very, very interesting space, which has a very complicated configuration setup, and it covers a specific case within industry. So perhaps I can expand a bit more on that. What's the difference between horizontal and vertical software as a service? So as I mentioned previously, horizontal software as a service is intended to be targeting a broader user base, where it's not particularly targeting a single industry, but more covering the base needs for all the industries. For example, email automation or any basic workflows. Whereas if you're looking into a vertical software as a service solution, one example of where the application for that would be is financial accounting, where you need to create a very specific workflow to compute accounting figures. Or alternatively, other example would be a workflow automation specific to an industry, where the specifics of the workflow are very tailored to the actual industry itself. And due to that, there are a few key differentiators between the two SaaS solutions. So the horizontal software as a service is targeting multiple business domains, where the vertical one is explicitly targeted towards a single one and solving a complicated problem within an industry from start to finish. And this is where the next differentiator comes into play, where the goal for horizontal software as a service solutions is to be fairly easy to use, to give everybody a very fast time to market to get to actual outcome, what he wants to achieve. But on the other side, they need to customize a lot in order to achieve their target outcome. Where the vertical software solution solves this problem differently. And the purpose of them is that they're fairly complex per nature, and they have a lot of integrated logic in them in order to meet the the business flow needs of the customers. And where it becomes really interesting is that while being complex and complete, they also have to provide a very fast turnaround times when you need to do adaptations for industry changes, regulatory changes, or most importantly, if a client would like to do changes on the system. And to achieve this outcome, it's important to consider how configuration management strategy fits into the picture. So when we look back from where it all started, primarily the companies looking for that kind of solutions are the ones which has taken the decision way back in the days to stick with a large enterprise on-premise solutions. And doing the leapfrog to directly SaaS or BPaaS solution, that basically takes a couple of layers of progression over time at once. So this means taking software as a service with the infrastructure and platform as a service and being able to host it on public clouds. And of course, that big jump carries a lot of challenges. And one of them is that the configuration typically is maintained within the client installations themselves. They are very specific to their needs. They're normally done by implementation teams, and they're maintained mainly by the customer themselves. And more importantly, they're also tested and have the test coverage created by the customer. Due to the broad styles of implementing such solution, the unification and standardization of such flows is oftentimes very difficult to handle, given the fact there is no central point to keep this configuration for multiple customers. And trying to get such customers to a SaaS or a BPaaS solution, one of the key challenges is to provide the same or better outcome for them, while trying to optimize the actual product variability or the service you provide in order to be able to scale it as such. And also when it comes to operational changes, there is always the need to deploy changes as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible, and without any risks. However, that's not the case, and it's typically a trade-off where if you want to, for example, reduce costs or lead time, then you need to reduce testing and therefore increase risk, or respectively, if you add more testers into a specific change, then that increases the costs. And achieving this as part of the operations to the three verticals is not possible, and it's always a trade-off. So how do we solve this in a software as a service solution or a BPaaS solution holistically to provide the net positive result on all the fronts without jeopardizing any of the outcomes? In order to answer that, we need to look at the configuration management and the configuration strategy as part of the bigger puzzle in software as a service or a BPaaS organization. Looking at it in isolation, it's not really possible to achieve this outcome, and it's not an item you can keep as an add-on to your product. So it really needs to take a very central place within the organization and different areas as part of it. So first and foremost, all starts with the business model and making sure that the configuration itself is aligned with what we sell and what we want to achieve. Secondly, the organizational structure is important to tailor towards service delivery. And since configuration is a very large part of a service delivery, the question is, how does this fit into organizational structure for delivering faster changes with good quality? Also, the solution itself needs to be fairly extensible to provide rapid changes and faster deployment times to production for the customers in order for them to meet their mission critical timelines and without jeopardizing the quality of their solution or any other deliverables. Also, configuration has to be a very essential part of the product development itself, or the product suite which is being developed, so that the whole strategy around how configuration is being handled is tightly integrated into the products themselves, and there is a interconnected way to manage the configuration. Another very important piece, probably the one of the most crucial one, is the DevOps. And how to build efficient pipelines for integration and delivery of changes when it comes to configuration. And last but definitely not least important is how to scale the solution and be able to maintain it while you grow your customer base. Whenever you get rapid growth of your service, it's important to be able to maintain it with the same or better level of quality without jeopardizing the business continuity of the customers. So I will start with the business model and what it means. So the first point which I would like to touch upon the business model is how to align the configuration with the with the complete offers which are being sold. So why is this important at first place? So the reason this is important is that, as I mentioned earlier, normally those solutions in vertical SaaS space are very complex. And if they're provided as a more of a incomplete solution or partially requiring parameterization or configuration, then the time to market for a customer increases, and that's what we want to avoid. We want to be able to deliver an outcome as fast as possible and have a very solid foundation on which the customers can start building or extending their workflows. The second point which is important around the business model is standardization versus extension points or toolboxes. And this is important for a few reasons, actually, and it may not be fairly obvious, but whenever a standard solution is provided instead of an extension point, then the actual maintenance service and surface and testing surface is reduced, because then there is a there is a faster way, or there is a unified way to deliver a certain outcome instead of providing an endpoint or a toolbox which it's difficult to control, it's difficult to test all the scenarios, and you don't exactly know how much is being used or how important it is for the customer needs. And that's where the third point of the business model alignment is. It's very important to have a way to track cost contribution per business flows or capability across all the stacks. And this is important in order to be able to take decisions which areas you need to standardize, which areas you need to keep more open for extension, and to be able to properly adjust your revenue stream and your cost attribution per offers within the company. And the last point in the list is the argument whether you need to go more towards subscription-based approach or allow add-ons on top of the platform. And the preference for a subscription comes from the fact that in order to provide it as a subscription, it implicitly means that you already have deployed the full functionality of the system to the customer. And only thing he needs to do is enable a setting or request additional subscription for that. And the actual time to delivering the outcome he needs is much faster, as opposed to having to consider it as additional add-on, which he needs to install. And furthermore, maintaining different add-ons requires testing them in context of different customers or different scenarios. Whereas if everything is integrated as part of the same configuration, then the actual stability of the system and being able to provide a faster turnaround time is greater. The next important pillar when we're talking about configuration management is how does it fit into the product development and how should it be built? And here I've listed 4 elements which I believe are very important for that. And first and foremost, it's important that the configuration management is easy to use for the users. And the primary target when we're talking especially about business configuration would be not very technical users. And they, as such, they need to have a very easy way to manage the configuration or develop what they want to achieve as an outcome fast without having a high learning curve. And that's typically a very common scenario to have a high learning curve in such setups, because the more specific they are, the more they require a tailor-made configuration management tool. Therefore, it's more difficult to find industry standard knowledge, and it requires more learning towards being able to achieve the result. So it's really important to simplify as much as possible the user interface and follow the mantra click but not code. Now, when we're talking about developing configuration management, we also need to be cautious of what footprint we're carrying as a service, and therefore how important it is to manage it efficiently. So in a software as a service or a BPaaS company, they're typically the 5 layers which need to be maintained, and that starts with the infrastructure all the way to the business process and the customizations. So the more customers there are on the system, it's important to reduce the growth of the configuration footprint as much as possible, but also be aware of how each of those layers can be maintained efficiently from the respective audience which is going to be involved in doing those adjustments. Another common situation with configuration management not being very pivotal in projects is that typically it becomes a bottleneck or becomes a challenge when an actual company grows rapidly, and it starts to become difficult to maintain all the configuration areas which it has. And this is the place where typically companies identify the need to build it efficiently. So in that sense, whenever you can, start early to think about this in order to make this growth of a SaaS company faster and with less risks as part of it. So when it comes to quality, which is very, very important point for vertical SaaS, since it ultimately delivers very mission critical functionality to the businesses in a certain industry. A few considerations as part of that is to be able to provide guardrails around the functionality and to ensure that the business teams, which are the typical users of those systems, they have sufficient flexibility to achieve what they want, but also they're well protected to not do anything which is damaging either the service or the specific change. And as part of that, it's very crucial to have a good testing framework built into it so that you can test as many scenarios or as many levels as possible your changes and ensure that they don't impact any other element of the system. And last but not least, analytics and audit are essential in a SaaS setup, especially when a SOC compliance is required, and full traceability of what was changed and what's the impact, not just functional, but also non-functional of the system, and whether it produces any risks or bottlenecks along the line. So another element for building an efficient configuration management is standardization, and as such, it's important to think about how you can make as standard as possible the configuration, how you can make the customizations following best practices, and you can reuse already approved changes instead of having to introduce yet another variability of the same functionality. And that needs to be a very integral part of a configuration management system in order to make the cost for using a standard much more accessible, as opposed to the typical solution, which is building it from scratch as fast as possible to achieve the outcome. And when we're talking about standardization and achieving the fast outcome, how we make the system extensible, but at the same time we allow we leverage as much as we can from standardization. And one way which this can be achieved is through configuration stacking, where the configuration itself is maintained only once at one place at full, and everything stacked on top of it is only a delta representation of it. This means that the most of the base fundamental components can be kept in a central repository, maintaining as many as possible generic components, and then they can be tailor-made against a specific offer. And furthermore, within the offer themselves, additional functionality can be built, but it's important that it only exists in one place. And if in case it needs to be moved, it needs to be used in different offers, then it needs to be generalized enough and then reused in both places. So this structure brings a lot of benefits, and one of them, which I would like to start with, is how you can test efficiently each of those complete offers. And that becomes very that provides a very robust way to achieve good quality, because instead of testing open APIs and toolboxes where you allow a lot of variability for customers to configure, you test a complete vertical of configuration and ensure that it works from start to finish. And furthermore, if you want to extend that, you can leverage the existing automation, testing, and documentation around it, as opposed to having to build everything from scratch as a customer component. And what this brings is also that it allows the customer configuration to become very slim, and that decreases the footprint of onboarding a new customer into the system. And that way, scaling becomes more streamlined. And furthermore, if there is a change to be applied, then you don't need to apply a change across every configuration item. Whereas if it exists only in one place, then you need to update it only at one place and one place only. And then any additional adjustments around it or incorporating that change is just a matter of inheriting this new version of the repository or the change itself. So looking into how this stacking of configuration works, I would like to touch upon how does it look from a DevOps point of view, and how actually you can use it in real life for managing configuration. And one way to do that is you can keep a central repository with configuration where the basic and the complete offer configuration is kept in one place. And that follows a very software-like release cycle where you can create major releases of the configuration. And each of those major releases then becomes the baseline for new customers. So if we take the example on the chart here, from release 1, we create a customer A. And what customer A exists as part of a configuration footprint is just an empty repository containing the base files needed to start the system. But because it's leveraging everything which already exists into the base configurations. It doesn't really require to copy or to assemble a new set of configurations specifically for this customer. It only contains an empty shell, allowing to add new workflows, but at the same time override specifics for the customers from the standard. So whenever a new customer gets created, assuming it starts with a fully standard configuration, then the first step of the process is to spin up the instance. Now here it's assumed that this is a single tenant deployment. However, it can work very similarly for multi-tenant deployments as well when it comes to the actual configuration management. And what's very interesting here is that even at the first run of deploying a customer, we already would have tests which we can run. And those tests would also be inherited from the actual base configuration. And that would allow a certainty that whatever we have in production and whatever the customer has as a configuration, it follows a certain quality control instead of having to build it from scratch for this particular customer. And this is where the rapid change of base configuration, which can be triggered through to compliance change, industry change, regulatory change, or anything else, or for example, a critical bug found in the configuration, then that becomes a very efficient process. Because what needs to happen then is that if the standard configuration gets updated, then the respective change can get promoted to the release. And from this release, every customer can point to the new version of the platform configuration. And pointing means that it doesn't need to integrate it, it needs only to reference it. And as such, then the actual customer configuration becomes baselined on the new platform configuration. And that happens literally with one click, which for people in the industry doing change management, integrating such changes, that's very, very fast compared to the standard. And what happens next? So once you get this new platform configuration as part of your customer configuration, then you create your new release. And here, because of this layering, what happens in effect is that all the layers, configuration layers, get assembled together, and that becomes a release package. And this release package can be tested on a continuous basis, taking the latest production environment. So in simple terms, that can be a staging environment where every configuration change, whether it comes from the actual customer, from the platform, or it comes from the offer, respectively, it can be tested with each individual customer, leveraging all the tests which exist, which were adjusted also as part of the change, regardless where, and at the same time keep the thin configuration footprint of the customer. And once the actual change is tested and completed, then it can get deployed in production. And that's how a typical process can look like when you want to produce a change. So if we take a less complicated example where a customer change only happens on the customer branch, meaning the customer itself wants to implement specific change for him, then the only thing which is going to happen is the delta of this change is going to be kept in his configuration layer and follow the same DevOps process towards deployment. So the next big challenge in this is how to handle major platform upgrades. And one of the ways how this can be achieved is that whenever a new version gets released, then that can be branched off from the main development branch, similar to how the first release was done. And because the customer branch is not really containing any platform configuration, it's only pointing to it, then the actual jump to a new platform release becomes very efficient. Then the only thing which needs to happen is that the new configuration, the customer configuration only needs to be carried over to the new release and then point to the respective platform release, instead of having to re-engineer from scratch or copy everything across. And what's also interesting about this is that while the new release is being tested and not yet released, at the same time, the actual configuration and business continuity can still work without any disruption on the previous release while integrating the changes into the next release. And what this means is that the actual switch between major versions becomes very seamless. It allows on one side to ensure that the necessary quality is met. You're not bound to any time windows or require you don't require a critical time period to deploy the changes, but only whenever the quality is met and the changes can be deployed. Only then the actual switch over can happen to the new release, and then take the latest production copy, move it to staging, ensure everything works, and then promote the changes to production and switch to the new version of the software, including the configuration. So some important considerations in the DevOps workflow is that, as we've seen, configuration repositories can actually be very complicated matter, and as such they can even be more complicated in building pipelines and process around the actual software development. And other important point is that during deployment of configuration, it's safe to assume that there would be some manual steps required as well. For example, if you change configuration impacting the transactions, then you need to reprocess transactions or do accounting rebooking or any other type of data change as part of the configuration release. So take into account that you always need to have a buffer for manual intervention or manual steps in the process for deploying configurations. And as we're talking about business configuration here, the compliance security audit is very important to be kept in place and have a full traceability of what was changed, when, and by whom. Another important consideration is that the documentation, if it's not part of the configuration itself, if it's kept somewhere externally and maintained manually, then that becomes a very high overhead to maintain. And the most efficient way to do that is keep it as part of the configuration release and be able to generate as much of it as opposed to having to manually maintain it. And only that way you can really scale efficiently with the next customer, as opposed to having to maintain per customer an audit and the documentation and the documenting each change done on each layer of the configuration. And the last point when it comes to DevOps is automation. And the reason why this is very important is that the DevOps flow itself, in order to be efficient, it needs to be automated. And if there is a manual step in the process, always consider whether it can be automated first before actually doing it manually. Because over time, this pipeline would be executed hundreds of times, and automation would always be the cheaper cost in the long run, as opposed to doing it manually. So the next pillar of configuration management is related to scalability and maintainability. And what's interesting about this is that if we take into account that we have the three layers, the three major parts of configuration, where below we have the standard, then we have the client configuration, and then parameterizing both the client configuration and standard one. if you're maintaining a SaaS or a BPaaS solution, then you need to ask the question, okay, how much does it cost to actually maintain this customization as opposed to integrate it as part of the standard and allow parameters to enable this functionality? And this answer actually can be vary from BPaaS to SaaS solution, where in the BPaaS solution, the company itself is responsible for managing the business flows. Therefore, the incentive to standardize is much greater. But also during SaaS, it's an important to consider that as well, because in order to maintain this client customization, you need to provide a foundation for it to work. And providing that foundation may also be more expensive than actually standardizing the functionality itself. And something important to mention is that when we're talking about implementing changes in SaaS world, the implementation is only the first time and it's only once, but the actual maintenance and deployment is the continuous cost which adds over time. Therefore, the process of keeping the optimal configuration structure is important to be constantly monitored and addressed to keep the optimal level of maintenance in the long run. And of course, if we look into the few comparisons why you would choose configuration over standard solution, one of the most obvious ones would be that the implementation can be much cheaper for customization compared to standard if a solution can be made fast by either the client in a SaaS setup or the provider in a BPaaS setup, as opposed to creating everything required to create a standard solution around it. However, it's important that in the long run, this cost diminishes because the cost of the implementation is typically the smallest one compared to the maintenance and operational one. Other important factor why customization might be the better choice in certain cases is the lead time. Since for creating a standard configuration, it typically requires a proper planning and can be only done by certain teams, whereas the actual customization can be done very rapidly by implementation teams or the customer itself. So there's always the use case to go with customization for sure, but it's important to keep intact when this customization becomes more of an overhead as opposed to keeping it as standard and providing the necessary parameters around it. Okay, so the last pillar of the six, which I mentioned, is about the organization structure. And why this is important is the fact that the whole organization, when it manages SaaS or a BPaaS solution, it needs to be oriented towards delivering outcomes and delivering service, which means that the actual team responsibilities, they need to be well aligned with what the outcome is. And when we're talking about configuration changes, that's typically delivering the change to production. And taking into, and if we look in a more classical product environment setup, typically the product team's responsibilities finish with delivering a release, whereas the delivering the actual outcome in the environments and in the service outcome then is either by third-party vendors, implementation teams, or a different division. So it's important that throughout the entire organization, the service mindset is included as part of the incentives for each team in order to allow the most efficient way to achieve the actual outcome which a service company is looking for, and that is to deliver the business value to the customer. Now, one interesting element is the level of expertise required for certain business domain knowledge. So, for example, if the software, the vertical software as a service is around accounting, then that requires a very deep knowledge of understanding how accounting works, understanding taxonomies, understanding other understanding IFRS or other industry standards. And as such, that raises the question, what is the best structure to actually maintain the configuration? In a typical agile setup, the teams would have all the capabilities needed to deliver the outcome. But when we're looking about delivering SaaS or a BPaaS, then the business domain knowledge might require or can consider two ways of structuring the teams, which means either if the configuration complexity and the business knowledge is not high, then they can be part of the development teams themselves. But if they require a very, very specific industry knowledge, then they can be a separate division, which is only concentrated around keeping the business processes and everything in the industry intact, and being able to understand regulations, how to implement them, and how to deploy them to market. So that reaches the end of the presentation, and therefore takeaways which I would like to take as part of it. And the first is that DevOps is a very important part of a SaaS and a BPaaS company, and it's important to start with this mindset whenever you actually start building the software, because whenever you reach growth, then the DevOps would be the thing which would facilitate growth without having to consider a lot of overhead. Another thing which is another key takeaway is that building a software as a service company or a BPaaS is not just an on-premise software put into a server on the web. It's important to be able to scale both vertically and horizontally the service and allow the customers to achieve the outcome they need without having to take a lot of lead time or a lot of complexity around their configuration, and be able to achieve the outcome they need. Now, the third takeaway is that when it comes to configuration, actually less is equal to more, and this means that if you handle configuration, then try to keep it as little duplications as possible. Ideally, you should have only one copy of one configuration and only reference it where it's needed. Only this would allow to actually scale efficiently without actually impacting quality and exploding costs when you want to actually do a change. And the last point of the list is about the total cost of configuration. And that actually applies not just for building for the configuration itself, but actually for the configuration system itself. That you need to have sufficient good framework to be able to build the configuration, but as well as maintain and operate it efficiently. And maintaining and operating are the bigger pillars in software as a service, as opposed to building a configuration, because over time that's the cost which gets carried over. And in order to understand why a certain cost exists, then it's also important to be able to measure it and make sure that it really delivers what the customers expect out of it. So with that, we conclude the presentation. Thanks a lot for your attendance, and I hope you found this interesting. So now let's get back to the studio for any questions from the audience.